I believe it's recording.
Great. Welcome, and thank you all for joining today's program on the National Popular Vote. My name is Rachel Poller, and I'm president of the League of Women Voters, Henderson County. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan grassroots political organization founded 101 years ago. Grounded in the struggle for women's suffrage, the League now studies, informs, and advocates on major public policy issues, including voter rights, fair districting, education, immigration, healthcare, and the environment. Our mission is empowering voters, defending democracy. The League is a national organization with over 700 chapters at the state and local levels. We celebrate diversity, equity, and inclusion by welcoming all members of our community. Our co-sponsors today are the League of Women Voters Asheville-Buncombe, the American Association of University Women, Carolina Jews for Justice, the Interfaith Initiative for Social Justice, Democracy NC, the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Hendersonville, and El Centro. I'm really excited about our program this evening and what we're all going to learn and hear about the National Popular Vote. It's a great program. We're recording, and this recording will be available in 24 hours on our YouTube channel. So if you want to share it with anyone else, that is on our website, League of Women Voters, Henderson County. Please mute yourselves. And any comments or questions, if you put them in the chat box, we'll be able to get them to Eileen and she'll answer. And so let me introduce our guest, Eileen Reavey, who's the National Grassroots Director for the National Popular Vote. She works on building momentum and support for this issue nationwide and on training volunteers to be organizers and informed advocates for the cause. Eileen started a grassroots group advocating for national popular vote in Oregon in 2016. And after successfully passing the bill there in 2019, joined the National Popular Vote team to build that type of energy and infrastructure nationwide. She's based in Portland, Oregon, and I'm so grateful for her for joining us this evening. So Eileen.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see all of you. I hope you're doing well. Thank you for joining tonight and having an interest in learning a little bit about National Popular Vote. So to start off with, I always like to start, even though acknowledging that this is the League of Women Voters and has an informed audience, but it's good to cover the basics of how do we really elect the president now? And I apologize, I'm just going to pause for 1 second because something is not showing up correctly on my end. There we go. There we go. So how do we elect the president? And of course, we use the Electoral College. So on election day, you and I cast our ballots for the candidates of our choice, but the real vote, the one that decides who the next president of the United States is in December, when electors meet and cast their ballots. So 538 electors meet and decide who the next president is. States are allocated one electoral vote for every representative that they have in Congress. So to win the presidency, you need a majority of the Electoral College. So that number currently is 270. So who are these people? They decide who the next president is, but we oftentimes don't actually know who they are. So these individuals are actually decided by the state legislature. The US Constitution gives explicit power to the states to decide how their electors are chosen. Specifically, Article 2, Section 1 says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So those 17 words are the entire instructions in the Constitution for how states should determine how their electors are chosen. And it says that it's completely up to the state legislatures. And this is a power that the Supreme Court has termed a plenary power or an exclusive power of the states. So currently, 48 states and DC, including North Carolina, choose their electors based on whoever received the most votes within their state on election day. We refer to these as winner-take-all laws or statewide winner-take-all laws. So how this plays out is that in California, if the Democratic candidate receives the most votes on election day, they get all 55 of California's electoral votes. Same thing in Texas. If the Republican candidate receives the most votes, they get all 38 electoral votes. So in 2020, if you're one of the 6 million Californians who cast your ballot for Donald Trump, or one of the 5.2 million Texans who cast your ballot for Joe Biden, your vote was effectively thrown out at the state line and not counted. The electors, when they were chosen based on the fact that the other person got the most votes in your state, and so all of them went on to represent that person when they cast their votes. So state law, how states vote in the Electoral College, is how we end up with divergent elections, where the popular vote winner is the Electoral College loser. And this has happened 5 times in our nation's history, where the candidate who received fewer votes nationwide became the president. Of course, most recently, the examples that we're the most familiar with are the 2016 and 2000 election. But when we look at the recent history of electing presidents, we've actually had 2 additional near misses in that same period of the last 20 years. Looking at those examples, in 2004, if 60,000 more voters in Ohio had cast their ballots for John Kerry instead of George Bush, John Kerry would have won the state of Ohio, won the Electoral College, and become the president despite losing the popular vote by a larger margin than Donald Trump did in 2016. And if 60,000 votes in one state sounds like a lot, it's really not. 115 million ballots were cast in that election. So 60,000 voters changing their mind and voting the other way in one state was certainly plausible. And the outcome of the entire election would have swung on that, despite George Bush winning the popular vote by over 3 million votes. And the second time that this happened was just last year, the 2020 election. We were so close to having another divergent election where Donald Trump won because he won the Electoral College, despite his popular vote loss of 7 million to Joe Biden. In fact, how close were we? We were less than 22,000 votes away from having that happen again. Specifically, if about 5,200 more voters in Arizona, 5,900 voters in Georgia, and 10,300 voters in Wisconsin had decided to vote for Donald Trump over Joe Biden, then Donald Trump would have won the electoral votes from those states and would have gone on to win second term as president. That's despite the fact that Joe Biden won by over 7 million votes for the popular vote. So when we talk about the issues of the way that we elect the president, this is the big one that comes to mind, right? The very obvious, glaring thing that's staring us all in the face is that the person who gets less votes can win the election. But there are actually a number of other problems with the way that we elect the president. So we refer to these as the battleground state problem. And because of the winner-take-all laws that most states use, it means that most states are decidedly red or decidedly blue before the election even begins. So candidates, when they're looking at the general election, they already at the beginning can write off the vast majority of states and say, this is going to go to the Democrat, this is going to go to the Republican, and they only campaign for a small number of votes in the closely divided states, which are the swing states or the battleground states. So the entire general election for the US presidency happens in a dozen or less states year after year. And the voters in those states are the ones who truly get to decide who the next president is. If we look at the 2012 campaign, which is what this map is representing, the number of general election events in the 2012 campaign, it happened, all of them in just 12 states. 2/3 of the events were in just 4 states, Ohio, Florida, Virginia, and Iowa. and 38 states were completely ignored in the general election, including 12 of the 13 smallest states and almost all of our 10 most rural states, much of the South, the entire West Coast, and much of the Northeast. Similarly, in 2016, virtually all campaign events, again, were in just 12 states, and 2/3 of those events were in just 6 states: Ohio, Florida, Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. In 2020, again, 96% of the general election campaign events were in just 12 states. And this past year, Florida and Pennsylvania together received 37% of all visits. And keep in mind, the general election was completely ran during the pandemic. A number of these events, particularly the events that were put on by Joe Biden's campaign, happened virtually. They could have had events all across the country just by having Zooms being opened up to more people. But the events were still very, very targeted to trying to get voters in specific states because those were the states that they needed to win the election. And so we know that these battleground states have this outsized power. They attract all of the attention during the general election, but the impacts of them having this much power, they're not just limited to where candidates campaign. It's not just about the fact that you might get to meet a presidential candidate because they came to your state in the general election. We find that this impacts policy, federal funding, and a lot of things throughout the way that our federal executive branch runs. So looking at federal grants. Dr. John Hudak from the Brookings Institute found that overall, controlling for variables such as a state size and natural disaster relief funds, presidential election swing states receive 7.6% more federal grants, worth about 5.7% more grant dollars between 1996 and 2008. And those numbers might not sound that large, but when we're talking about the federal budget, this equates to huge amounts of money. If we take, for example, Tennessee, which is an average size state, the last census, if they had been a swing state in 2008, they would have been likely to have received 300 more federal grants worth a total of $60 million every year that they were a swing state leading up until the next election. Similarly, highly competitive swing states get twice as many disaster declarations as non-competitive or flyover states. A lot of money comes with these declarations, and you'd think that a lot of factors would go into deciding where those funds should go. The severity of the disaster, the amount of local infrastructure that was impacted, the ability of the state government to respond. Maybe there's a compounding event. There was already a hurricane in that state just a month earlier, and they're really at their end of their ability to respond to people in a timely manner. All of that is what you think would go into the calculation for where should these disaster declarations go. But at the end of the day, when you look at the fact that swing states are getting twice as many disaster declarations as safe states, then you realize that politics are being played here. And ultimately, it's good to remember that the money that these programs are going to, it's very needed, right? No matter where it goes, it's still responding to a disaster. Those federal grants are still going to worthy programs, no matter where they're going in the United States. But ultimately, what's happening is that whoever is in power in government at that time is able to leverage the federal resources paid for by tax country in order to win favor with voters to try and help their party win the next election, either if it comes from Congress helping it, or if it comes from the president trying to put forth programs in particular states because they want to win re-election or they want the person after them to be of the same political party. And so you see all of this favoritism playing out in a very targeted way for swing states to get all these additional benefits. So what does all this add up to? Battleground states get more campaign events, they get more federal grants, more disaster declarations. All of those things are a proxy for power in our political system, and battleground states seem to have all the power. And it goes beyond funding as well, and we see it shaping policy. So we see candidates proposing policies that are specifically geared towards winning over specific types of voters in certain swing states. So let's look at two examples of that. No Child Left Behind was proposed by a Republican candidate for president and was the largest federal action taken into public education in the history of our country. Now, the federal government getting involved in something traditionally run by states through a huge program is not what you would typically expect from a Republican candidate for president, right? But this policy was geared towards winning over education minded voters, moms, in the critical suburb area of Ohio. And in fact, this law was signed into law in the Cincinnati suburbs after George Bush won this election, in part because of Ohio and, of course, because of his victory in Florida. And while this bill was on the books, swing states were twice as likely to get exemptions from No Child Left Behind as flyover states. Similarly, people on both sides of the aisle do this. When the Obama administration was running for re-election, they had a federal tax credit program promoting clean energy. Ohio companies got nearly 4 times the average that went to other states. So states that happen to be closely divided during an election year benefit immensely from being a battleground state. But it's important to remember that these states can change from election to election. And the perks of being a battleground state are fleeting. States that were benefiting in 2016, like Virginia, we saw them be one of the states that was in the top 4 for the number of events that they had. In 2020, they were a safe blue state. We knew that how they were going to go. They received 1 campaign visit in the entire election, and it was specifically advertised as actually being meant to entice North Carolina voters because it was right on the border, and they just had a larger event venue on the Virginia side of the border. And so Virginia has found themselves out in the cold with the 38 other safe states in this past election. And it's very likely that North Carolina could very quickly go that direction as well. That you were a battleground state in 2020, absolutely, but there's no guarantee that you will be in 2024 or certainly further beyond that as we see these states shift. And so that's why it's important when we're talking to state legislators and thinking about wanting change. People might say, well, we benefit from the current system, but it's good to remember that you're not always going to. And so we should think about, well, how can we make the system better for everyone all the time? And that brings us to how we should elect the president. The national popular vote, that whoever gets the most votes should become the president. This is how we elect almost every other office in the country. It's good enough of a way to elect our senators, our governors, our state legislators, all the way down to the city dog catcher. This is how we elect our other offices. And it's time we modernize our presidential elections to make every vote equal. Every vote being equal would mean that candidates would have to care about the entire country's interest, not just the interest of those that are in swing states. So we'd break the system where candidates are advocating for positions that poll well with certain voters and are only listening to the concerns of people in certain states. As an example, if we'd had a national popular vote in the 2020 election, maybe we would have heard about, either in the vice presidential or presidential debate, the wildfires that were ravaging much of the country and in fact affecting states that 1 in 5 Americans lived in. But that wasn't spoken about. What did come up at both debates was fracking. And the amount of people employed by the fracking industry in the entire country is less than the number of people employed by the logging industry in Oregon. But no one talks about the logging industry. We talk about fracking because it's an issue that's important to a small number of Pennsylvania voters, and it gets national attention despite the very small amount of people that it ultimately affects, while something that's affecting a huge amount of Americans just gets completely ignored because it was only affecting states where we already knew how their electoral votes were going to go. And so the way that we can do this is through the National Popular Vote Bill, or the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is the official title of the bill. So the National Popular Vote Bill would guarantee the presidency to the candidate who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states and DC. This is a bill passed by states to change how they vote in the Electoral College. So by replacing the existing state winner-take-all law with a new law that awards all of a state's electoral votes to the candidate who wins the popular vote in all 50 states and DC. And this bill only goes into effect in all of these states when states collectively with 270 electoral votes or more have been committed to the compact. And so that number it's 270 because that's what we need to win the Electoral College. So when we have enough votes committed to the national popular vote winner to win the Electoral College, that's when our bill goes into effect in all of these states that have passed it. And then we'll know that for the next election, whoever wins the national popular vote will automatically win the Electoral College and will change the way that America's elections are run and change the way we elect the president. The reality of our country is that we are a compilation of different people with diverse opinions who happen to live in certain states. When I cast my ballot on election day, I know I'm thinking about what's most important to the entire country, not just my specific state. So I cast my ballot as an American, not an Oregonian or a Floridian or a Marylander or anything else. And I think most people feel the same way. And the National Popular Vote Bill allows our electoral system to reflect this reality about America and have the true will of the people to decide who sits in the one office that represents all of us. And so if this plan sounds far-fetched, I have good news for you. This bill has already been passed by 15 states and DC for a total of 196 electoral votes. So we're actually over 70% of the way there towards reforming the Electoral College and changing the way that America elects the president for good. So far, in 2019, I should say, 4 states passed our bill, which was the highest number of states that we've had pass it in a single legislative session so far. Right now, our bill is pending before 13 other state legislatures, and a few more we expect will be introduced later this year. And so with just a few more states of the right combination of states, we will change the way that we elect the president once we get just 74 more electoral votes. And so when we talk about this reform, it's good to remember that this is a nonpartisan solution. This is not a left or a right issue. This is not a reaction to the Donald Trump presidency or him being elected. Our organization was in existence a full decade before he was elected. It's not about him or any other individual. It's about putting voters first. It's an American issue that everyone can get behind. Let's make every vote equal. Let's make it so that whoever gets the most votes wins, and let's have an outcome for the presidential election that all of us can get behind. And if you're thinking, oh, I don't know, I'm not so sure this is constitutional. The only way to get one person, one vote is by abolishing the Electoral College. That's just not true. That is the way that more people are familiar with, absolutely. But electing the president by national popular vote is constitutional because deciding how electors are chosen is an exclusive power of the states. So we go back to those 17 words that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. And so absolutely, that the states will be allowed to award their electoral votes to the national popular vote winner. The winner-take-all system that they use now, the congressional district system method that Maine and Nebraska use, those aren't explicitly authorized in the Constitution, and neither is any other way. And so we know that awarding it by national popular vote, as long as it's passed by the state legislature, is fully allowable. And you might be thinking, okay, I accept that premise, but isn't there something in the Constitution about interstate compacts and congressional consent? So yes, Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution does say that congressional consent is required for interstate compacts. However, the Supreme Court has ruled that congressional consent is only needed for compacts that encroach upon federal supremacy. And because this is a bill that, because this is something that explicitly deals with a power of the states, it doesn't encroach upon federal supremacy, and so congressional consent is not needed. Now, that being said, if after our bill reaches 270 electoral votes, the Supreme Court decides to overturn 100 years of precedent and say that we need congressional consent, that's okay. That's not the end of the momentum or the movement. That's just one more thing that we have to do. And we'll go and lobby Congress at that time the same way that we've lobbied all 50 state legislatures across the country on this bill. Next up, a question that comes up frequently is on the idea of withdrawing from the compact. And so states are able to withdraw from the compact. However, they cannot do so between a really important 6-month period of July 20th of a presidential election year and 6 months later, which is Inauguration Day. And so the compact must be in effect with at least 270 electoral votes by that July 20th cutoff. And then for the next 6 months, if any state tries to enter or leave, it's not effective until after the next president is inaugurated. And the purpose for that being that we don't want any state to try and be able to play partisan politics with the election and say, take a big state like California. If it were October and they said, ooh, okay, we've got a Democratic legislature, we've got a Democratic governor, it looks like the Democratic candidate's going to lose the national popular vote, but they would have won under the old system. We're going to withdraw from the compact real quick so that it goes back to the old system. That cannot happen. It's specifically in the language of the interstate compact preventing this. And that would be enforced by the US Supreme Court because Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 of the Constitution is the impairments clause. And states cannot break the contract with each other, which is essentially what an interstate compact is how states enter into contracts with each other. And no state in the history of the Republic has ever left an interstate compact without adhering to the terms of that compact. So this is pretty ironclad that these states, they're not going to be able to withdraw at certain times to try and game the system or play partisan politics with this. A second related question that we get is, okay, well, they're not going to withdraw at this certain time, but I'm nervous that in 2024, we'll have a national popular vote, and then we'll drop back to the old system because some state will withdraw and it'll go back and forth, and that could be confusing for people. So while that is technically feasible, I don't think that that's going to happen. And the reason for this is because once we have a national popular vote for president, tens of millions of people across this country are going to be newly enfranchised in their vote for the US president. They're going to know for the first time that their vote matters. I believe we're going to see higher voter turnout because in battleground states now, we see that voter turnout between 9 and 11% higher than in the rest of the country. And so across the country, we're going to have people saying, no, we absolutely want this. We want to keep this way of electing the president. So even if one state does drop off or two, we as an organization are still going to be working all across the country to make sure that we add more and more electoral votes so that this becomes the way that the president is elected. Even if we lose one or two states, we've got enough of a buffer that it continues to be elected by the national popular vote. Another good thing to keep in mind when we talk about this, a lot of people have questions about what the founders or the framers of the Constitution would think, but they didn't create our modern way of electing the president. Right? What they did was come up with the concept of electors choosing the president, and they took many votes over a couple of weeks on how the electors should be chosen. They voted on the congressional district system method that Maine and Nebraska used. They voted on the national popular vote. They voted on governors picking the electors. What they didn't vote on was the winner take all law that is now commonplace and is the way that our president is really chosen, is through winner take all laws, because no one had thought of it at that time. And it wasn't until the 10th election for US president that a majority of states used winner take all laws, meaning that the framers had been dead for a decade at least by the time our current system was in place. So the system we have now is not what they envisioned. And so when we're talking about what would they think, that's an important thing to keep in mind. Also, they decided to leave it up to the state legislatures as the closest body to the people that they could decide what was best for the voters in their state. And that's exactly what we're asking state legislatures to do, right? We don't expect right now, we wouldn't be okay with our state legislatures trying to pass laws to limit voting to the people that were allowed to vote at the founding of our country, right? In the first presidential election, only 5 states allowed any citizens to vote in any form for president. And those citizens were a very limited bunch of wealthy white men, leaving much of the population, obviously including women, including poor people, and including people that were horrifically enslaved at this time, completely out of the picture, right? That's not a system we need to go back to. That's not a framework that we need to be comparing the way that we elect our president to. We need to be thinking about what makes sense for America now, what is the right thing to do, and that's what we're asking our state legislators to do. And luckily, it's in the Constitution that we can go about it that way of making this change by going to our state legislatures. Another question that comes up a lot is, well, isn't the Electoral College supposed to protect the small states? And aren't the small states sort of giving up that ability if we adopt this national popular vote? So no, the Electoral College was not created to protect small states. The conflict at the signing of the Constitution was not between big and small states. It was between the North and the South, with the issue really being over states that allowed slavery and those that did not. That's where that tension came from. It wasn't the big and small states that a lot of us believe was the reason we have the Electoral College. And the Senate exists to give equal suffrage to the states, actually. And if we look at the system now, because of winner take all laws, the small states, so if we say those with 3 and 4 electoral votes, that's 13 states, they are actually the most disadvantaged and ignored group of states under the current system because of the fact that they are not swing states. If you look at those 13, 6 are decidedly Republican, 6 are decidedly Democratic. 1 is sometimes a swing state, but has been kind of moving away from that category. And these small states, they're not ignored because of their low population. They don't get outsized attention because of the greater number of electoral votes they have in proportion to their population. They're ignored because they're not battleground states, and all of the power comes from being a battleground state. And you don't just have to take my word for it either. Legislators in Hawaii, Delaware, Vermont, DC, and Rhode Island have all looked at our bill and signed on, realizing that this was better for the citizens of their state because they're completely ignored now and they won't be under a national popular vote. And similarly, people sometimes fear that, oh, the candidates are just going to go to DC, or excuse me, to LA and New York City and, our 10 biggest cities, and the rest of the country is going to be completely ignored. Now, this is a common misconception, but if you really look at the numbers, it's not one that people should really be concerned about. If you add up the population of the 100 largest cities in America, which number 100 on that list is Spokane, Washington, with 208,000 people. And Spokane is not exactly a liberal metropolis. That 100 largest cities makes up 19% of the US population. It just so happens that rural America, as defined by the US Census, also makes up 19% of the American population. So you could no more just campaign to those people in the 100 biggest cities than you could just to rural America. You've got to talk to both groups, and also, very importantly, to the 62% of people who live in the suburbs in between those areas. And people in the suburbs are evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. So you can't just say, I'm going to go campaign in New York and California and expect to win. You're not going to win the national popular vote if any candidate chose to do that. Candidates are going all over because American population is all over the country. And so when we have a national popular vote, we're going to no longer have this system where we have flyover states and irrelevant voters and hyper relevant voters. We're going to have it be one person, one vote, with every vote being equal. And we're going to see candidates going all across the country because they know that regardless of where a ballot is cast, it has an equal opportunity to win them the election. And so kind of in summary, the National Popular Vote Bill guarantees the presidency to the candidate with the most votes. incentivizes candidates to campaign in all 50 states. We'll see that candidates will go all across the country, and every vote will be equal. And hopefully we'll see increased voter turnout across the country as tens of millions of people are newly engaged in the system, realizing that their vote can make a difference in the presidential election. So for getting involved with this, in North Carolina, we have a grassroots group of folks that meet once a month. If you would like to join that, the best way to do so is through nationalpopularvote.com/volunteer. You can get linked in with that group. Going out and giving trainings, giving presentations to other groups that you might be a part of and asking them if they'll take action with you to talk to your state legislators about this bill. Writing a letter to the editor, or absolutely, of course, writing your own state legislators. You can do so at this link that you see here, nationalpopularvote.com/write, WRITE. If you put that in, you can customize your own letter to a state legislator so that you can let them know that this is an issue you really care about. In North Carolina, Senator Nickel has been a longtime supporter of ours and is who will we expect to be introducing the bill a little bit later this session. And we are, there's a lot of work to be done, not just in North Carolina, but across the country as we advocate for this issue. So you can also, if you really want to jump on this and take action, if you sign up to volunteer, there's also opportunities to help us with phone banking into some of these other states that are having these activities as well. And of course, just reaching out to friends and family about this issue, because while you might know, just a few people in your immediate area, maybe all of your family is in Michigan, and this is an issue that they could know about and be really engaged in, because we need everyone across the country to come together around this movement in order to get us over the finish line. We're not just going to do it with, just lobbying or anything like that. We really need citizens from all around the country standing up and saying, I really want to see this change. And I hope that you, my state legislator, will vote for it and be a champion of this, because this is a really important issue to make all of our votes equal. And so with that, I will stop and take some questions. Thank you all for tuning in so far.
Thank you so much, Eileen. Lot of information there. And we have a number of questions. So Karen, would you ask a question or?
Sure. I'm just going to ask the first one that came up. I think I know some of the questions were answered, but the first one that popped up is, what will be the purpose of the Electoral College if the popular vote is approved?
So it will still exist that the electors will still be chosen from each state. They will still go and vote in December. All of that structure remains the same. There are a number of state legislators who support this bill, who don't support getting rid of the Electoral College. The reason for that being they think that there's a benefit of being able to try it out first to make sure it works as expected. That scary unintended consequences argument that people like to throw out. That's something that we can make sure that everything goes as expected first when we move to a national popular vote. But overall, the Electoral College still exists as a general framework for the way that we elect the president with the national popular vote.
A question? I don't know how you do the questions.
If you put the question in the chat, then we can ask them in the order in which they
okay.
arrive.
All
Thank
right.
you. Do you want me to keep going, Rachel? Or?
The next question that I saw was, why would Republican states go along with this? The question was based on looking at the map where all 17 of the states looked pretty left-leaning, and to sort of piggyback on that, my question was, why haven't any of those small red states joined on?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So yes, when you look at the states that have joined national popular vote, they are overwhelmingly blue. When the bill passed in New York in 2014, It was actually the Republican Senate that passed it at the time, and this was endorsed by the Conservative Party of New York. We've also been passed by Republican majority chambers in Oklahoma and in Arkansas. However, since the 2016 election, unfortunately, this issue has become more politicized. And since then, we haven't seen as much Republican support across the country. We still have some, but it's not as widespread as it once was. We are hopeful that that might be changing, though. To answer the second part of the question, why would Republicans support this? Sometimes, people think, okay, let's look at the last 7 presidential elections. Republicans have only won the popular vote once. Why on earth would they support this, right? But no one was trying to win the national popular vote in any of those 7 last elections. So that's not really a good framework to look at. But what you can look at is the vote totals within the battleground states. If we look at 2016 and 2020, and you look at the 12 battleground states in both of those elections, in 2016 and in 2020, Donald Trump won the popular vote collectively in those 12 states. In 2016, he won them in the right states in order to also win the Electoral College. In 2020, he won the collective popular vote by over 1 million votes, but he didn't get those votes in the right set of states in order to win the election. Now, if I were a Republican legislator or consultant to someone, running for president as a Republican, I'd say, you're better off under the national popular vote, because this is an unstable system for either party. It worked in 2016 for Donald Trump, and then it didn't work for him in 2020. And we'd all be better off if we were just going off of the simple idea of one person, one vote. And let's try and convince the most amount of Americans that this is the right principle, that the principles that we as Republicans would be campaigning on, because you can see that when they were campaigning in battleground states, they were competitive with the Democrats. So it's not fair to assume that Democrats are always going to win under a national popular vote.
Thanks, Eileen. We had a couple questions just about the history of the Electoral College and why that was implemented the way it was, whether it was to protect, you touched on this a little bit, but we've had 2 questions come up, whether it was to protect slaveholding people or landholders.
Yeah, so when we were at the founding of the country, the way to elect the president was actually one of the very last things decided. It was in a conference committee of unfinished business. And this was one of the last things that they ultimately voted on because they could not agree. They took over 30 votes over 22 separate days, spread out over a number of weeks on this issue, and they went back and forth on it. Ultimately, when they made this decision, it sounds a little strange, but it was actually a low stakes decision, because at the time they knew who the first president was going to be. Regardless of whatever system they set up, George Washington was going to be the first president. And so they just had to come up with a system that the North and the South would agree to. So that's where that comes in, about the fact that in the South, in the slaveholding states, they wanted to have enough power so that the North, which had a much greater population of, if we were just looking at white men or white members of the country, they had more population. They didn't want them to be able to vote in a Northern president who would outlaw slavery. And so they copied over the horrific 3/5 compromise that was used for taxation and representation in the US House of Representatives. They kind of took that over and said, okay, we're also going to base the way that we elect the president off of that. And that's because when we look at the Electoral College, the states, they don't just get, the 2 electors based on their 2 US representatives. They get them for every member that they have in Congress. And at that time, the Southern states had a greater representation in Congress because they were able to count people that were certainly not seen as voting members of society in any way, as 3/5 of a person for population purposes. And if someone has a more specific question, I can expand on that. And there's actually, if you really want to get into this topic, there's a really good book called Let the People Pick the President, that Jesse Wegman wrote earlier this year. He's a New York Times editorial board member, which really gets into the history of this if anyone's particularly wants to dive in.
Other questions?
There was another question. There were a couple questions about North Carolina. Where was it passed, North Carolina? When was it passed? Are there deadlines for states to pass this? And I guess that applies to North Carolina. If it was passed, I know it was passed a number of years ago. Do we have a deadline by which it has to be passed by both chambers? And then in general, across the country, is there a deadline for states to pass this?
Yeah. So within each state, the bill has to be passed by the Senate, the House, and signed by the governor within the same legislative session. So depending on what state you're in, that can be as short of a 30-day period or about a 2-year period in that legislative session. So we show that on that map of states where national popular vote has passed in at least one chamber to show momentum. These are the states where we've got a lot of support and we're building off of that support. But in all of those states, we would still need to pass it in both chambers and get it signed by the governor in that same year. In North Carolina, the last time that this bill was passed was by the Senate all the way back in 2007. But things are shifting in North Carolina politically right now. You don't need me as someone who's not in North Carolina to tell you that. So we certainly think that this is the right time to be reapproaching the issue with the legislators there. So we've been meeting with Democrats and with Republicans throughout the state to try and get their support for this issue.
Here's an interesting question. Would it be easier to just outlaw the winner take all?
Great question. So this is something that was actually attempted a number of years ago. A number of states thought that New York actually had too much power, and were trying, because they were a swing state at the time, and were trying to sue New York to get rid of the winner take all law. And this was about 40 years ago. And it was not heard. And so I'm not sure that it would be easier because it would actually require a constitutional amendment, which I would say would be a much harder way to go about changing the system. And if you just outlawed winner take all, there are still some other ways that, after that, then states could just do the congressional district system method, which honestly, it has a lot of flaws. The number one being it further incentivizes gerrymandering of congressional districts. That states could still also use the proportional allocation method. Both of those, they're not systemic fixes. And that's what we need to be focused on when we're talking about the Electoral College, is that 1 or 2 or 3 states changing their state laws doesn't fix the bigger picture. And it's only through states working together to reform the system that we can guarantee the presidency of the person with the most votes. We can make sure voters in all 50 states in DC have an equal opportunity to elect the president, and that we can make every vote equal.
We've had a couple questions about helping to disseminate information. In 24 hours, this program the recording will be available on our website. So you wouldn't have to send the recording to other people. That was the question. You could just send them to our website. They could click on it and then watch it. But Eileen, there was also a question about how to contact you for presentations to other groups.
Great. I will put my email in the chat here, but I'll just also say it aloud for recording purposes. So it's Eileen, EILEEN @nationalpopularvote.com. And if you send me an email there, I'll be happy to speak to other groups as well.
Here's a question. How does ranked voting fit into the picture?
Great question. So ranked choice voting is compatible with national popular vote, but overall it's a different type of reform. So ranked choice voting is where you rank your candidates in order of preference. So maybe you might say Joe Biden number 1, Joe Lieberman number 2, Hillary Clinton 3, Bernie Sanders 4, Donald Trump 5. You can rank your candidates in whatever order you want. So Individual states do use this system now to award their electors. Maine did in 2020, Alaska will in 2024. So that's what we mean when we say that they're compatible, that we can have states using ranked choice voting and still calculate the national popular vote. But overall, it's a different reform. It's something that, again, if you just had ranked choice voting in all 50 states within the Electoral College, it's again getting back to that idea of not being a comprehensive or systemic fix. I think it is worth noting that the main group that advocates for ranked choice voting, which is Fair Vote, was actually the very first organization that endorsed the National Popular Vote Compact back in 2006. So we, our long time, have worked with them and appreciate their work, and we made sure that our plans kind of work together.
Great. So here are two other similar questions. One, this sounds fair and equitable. Why isn't it catching on, especially when there's great discrepancy between popular votes in the Electoral College? And then how does this good idea interface with the ongoing efforts right now by numerous state legislatures to suppress votes of minority voters and residents of their state? So those two questions.
So as far as why isn't it catching on more, I think a lot of the issue comes with state legislators being a little afraid of change and, you know, not wanting to go against the way things are. You know, they think, oh, well, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe these last elections, you know, weren't that big of a deal. And a lot of people buy into what we call like folk civics, where what you think you know about the Electoral College and what you very fairly might have been taught, if you really look at the history, isn't true. When you really dig into the numbers and facts on a lot of these things, you know, people think, okay, the Electoral College was supposed to protect small states, but no, that's not really what it was about. It was about protecting slaveholding states and giving them extra power, not giving small states extra power. Or people have that fear of, oh, well, no, I'm a moderate voter in Tulsa, and I don't want the campaign to just be decided by people in LA and New York City. I don't want a national popular vote. You've got to then dig in with the numbers with those people. So I think that's some of it, is a lack of awareness around those types of things. State legislators not necessarily wanting to rock the boat too much with this type of change. And then, of course, you know, we have national opposition from groups like the Heritage Foundation and some other conservative think tanks that are working against this for their own reasons. And so we see some of their advocating being effective as well, because they can kind of just sow enough doubt on the issue that it makes people be a little bit concerned about it, right? Because it's not a minor thing to change the way we elect the president, and state legislators, rightfully so, take that seriously and sometimes err a little bit too much on being pretty cautious. I will also say the 2016 election understandably caused a lot of people to say, ooh, I don't want to change this right now, regardless of what, you know, who I supported in the election. Whatever way I vote on this issue, it's going to be seen as a partisan thing. You know, it's going to be seen as a reaction to Donald Trump's election, and I don't want that. So hopefully we're getting a little bit further away from that, so that we'll continue to see progress in the next couple of years, because we really only need 5 or 6 more of the right states to pass this in order for this to be in effect by the 2024 election. And I'm sorry, Rachel, could you remind me of the second part of that question?
Just how this sort of interfaces with, in fact, current attempts by state legislatures to suppress voter turnout.
Yeah, I mean, it's a separate issue overall, but we certainly, you know, national popular vote only takes a stance on this one issue. Personally, I would categorize those other voter suppression efforts as very concerning. I think when we talk about the issue of voter suppression, we see groups specifically targeting that type of effort. Actually, specifically the Heritage Foundation, as I just mentioned, they recently announced that they were spending $10 million to support those voter suppression efforts in a number of swing states. So it intersects in the way that we see those efforts being really targeted in states because they know that it can change the outcome of the election. Similarly, if you are on the flip side of that and say, I don't believe in voter suppression, I believe in voter protection, I believe that we have fraud and we have all of these concerns with our electoral system, then you should also be supportive of a national popular vote, because it's the current system that is much more susceptible to having the outcome be changed either through voter suppression or through voter manipulation. Because if you can change 537 votes in Florida in the 2000 election, you swung the election for the entire country. If you either, again, through voter suppression or voter fraud, changed just 22,000 votes in 3 states in 2020, you would have handed Donald Trump a second term. So the current system is much more susceptible to that type of manipulation. And so having a national popular vote is actually an election security measure, that it would make our elections more secure and more resistant to that type of attack.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? We're really running at the end of our hour. And I just want to thank you so much, Eileen. This has been an incredible program. My mind is sort of, this is, it is a very complicated sales pitch. Is there a line? Is there a sentence? I have been on the NPV website, which really provides an incredible wealth of information. But do you have like one line, something going forward that when people finish, they could turn to their husband or wife and say, or a partner or a friend or whoever, and say, here's why we have to support the national popular vote?
Yeah, the national popular vote will guarantee the presidency to the person who gets the most votes, make every vote equal, and make it so that candidates campaign in all 50 states. And that's better for everyone in the country.
Fabulous. Thank you so very much, and for your ongoing work. I want to thank everyone here for attending, and of course our co-sponsors. Special thanks to Karen Kessler, our Voter Services Chair, and the entire Voter Services team, and to our technology gurus, Liz Hill and Nan Jennings, for making this such a seamless, effortless looking production. I just want to remind folks that our ALICE group is meeting on Thursday, April the 8th at 3 p.m. Brenda Shearer, our League Vice President, will be talking on racism, the cost of racism for everyone. On Thursday, April 22nd, we'll have a panel discussion on affordable housing. On Thursday, April 29th, the people-powered Fair Maps Day of Action. So please join us to email, tweet, and call our legislators in support of Fair Maps. And for much more information and details on all of these programs, please check out our website, League of Women Voters, Henderson County, North Carolina, LWVHCNC.org. And thank you all again. And if you want to watch the video again, that will be on our website, on our YouTube channel in 24 hours. Thank you so much.